All right. Shalom, everyone. Welcome to the next part of Translators Revived by Alexander McClure. I'll just reread, this page, the close of the first group. This closes what we have to say of that first Westminster Company of 10 members to whom was committed the historical books beginning with Genesis and ending with the second book of Kings, once commonly called, as its title still says, the fourth book of the Kings. The Second Company of King James Translators held its meeting in Cambridge. To this section of those learned divines was assigned from the beginning of Chronicles to the end of the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. The 8 men to whom this important part of the work was assigned was to no wit behind their associates in fitness for their great undertaking. Okay. Edward Lively. He is commemorated as one of the best linguistics in the world. He was a student and afterwards a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and King's Professor of Hebrew. He was actively employed in the preliminary arrangements for the translation and appears to have stood high in the confidence of the king. Much dependence was placed on his surpassing skill in the Oriental tongues, but his death, which took place in May 1605, disappointed all such expectations and is said to have considerably retarded the commencement of the work. Some say that his death was hastened by his too close attention to the necessary preliminaries. His stipend had been but small, but after many troubles and the loss of his wife, the mother of a numerous family, he was well provided for by Dr. Barlow, that he might be enabled to devote himself to the business of the great translation. He died of a quinsy after 4 days' illness, leaving 11 orphans destitute of necessities for their maintenance, but only such as God and good friends should provide. He was author of a Latin exposition of 5 of the minor prophets and of a work on chronology. Dr. Pusey of Oxford says that Lively, whom Pope Coke never mentions, but with great respect, was probably next to Pope Coke the greatest of our herborists. Maybe this is somebody that deals in natural herbs, possibly. Okay, John Richardson. Okay, this profound divine was born in Linton in Cambridgeshire. He was first fellow of Emmanuel College, then master of Peterhouse from 1608 to 1615, and next master of Trinity College. He was also King's Professor of Divinity. He was chosen Vice Chancellor of the University in 1617 and again in 1618. He died in 1625 and was buried in Trinity College Chapel. He left a bequest of £100 to Peterhouse. He was noted as a most excellent linguist, and every good theologian must be, for as Coleridge says, language is the armory of the human mind, and at once contains the trophies of its past and the weapons of its future conquest. In those days it was the custom at seats of learning for the ablest men to hold public disputes in the Latin tongue, with a view to display their skills in the weapons of logic and the dialectic fence, as the ancient knights delighted to display and exercise their skill and strength in running at tilt and ambically breaking spears with one another, so the great scholars used to cope with each other in the arena of public argument and strive for literary mastery. Those scholastic tournaments were sure to be got up whenever the halls of science were visited by the king or some chief magnate of the land, and the logical conflicts, always conducted in the Latin tongue, were attended with as much absorbing interest as were the shows of gladiators among the Romans. On such an occasion, when James I was visiting Cambridge, an extraordinary act in divinity was kept for His Majesty's entertainment. Dr. John Davenant, a famous man and afterwards Bishop of Salisbury, was respondent. His business was to meet all comers who might choose to assail the point he was to defend, namely, that kings might never be excommunicated. Well did Dr. Davenant urge the wordy war, till our Dr. Richardson pushed him tremendously with the example of Ambrose, the famous Bishop of Milan, who to the admiration of the whole Christian world, excommunicated the Emperor Theodosius the Great. Here was a poser. King James, who was always very nervous on the subject of regal prerogative, saw that his champion was staggering under that stunning fact, and to save him cried out in a passion, "Verily, this was a great piece of insolence on the part of Ambrose." To this Dr. Richardson calmly rejoined, "A truly royal response, and worthy of Alexander. This their cutting our naughty arguments instead of untying them." And so, taking his seat, he desisted from further discussion. The mild dignity of this remonstrance, in which independence and submission are happily combined, presents him in such a light as to constrain us to regret that this detached incident is about all we know of the personal character of the man. We can readily believe that he was a wise and faithful as well as learned translator of the Book of God. Okay, and I'm not even going to try to read that. Okay, so now we'll move on to Lawrence Chatterton, D.D. Okay, Lawrence Chatterton. This divine was a staunch Puritan, brave and godly, learning and laborious, full of moderation and the old English hardihood. He was born at Chatterton in Lancashire in the year 1537. His family was wealthy, but bigoted in popery, in which religion he was carefully bred. Being destined to the bar, he was set to the Inns of Court at London, where he spent some years in the study and practice of the law. Here he became a pious Protestant, and forsaking the law, entered as student at Christ College, Cambridge. Oh, that in a far higher sense all divinity students might be trained in Christ's own college and learn their science from the great teacher himself. These changes took place in 1564. Mr. Chatterton applied to his father for some pecuniary aid, but the wrathful old papist sent him a poke with a groat in it to go a begging, and disinherited his son of a large estate. The son had to occasion to use the begging poke. His high character and scholarship procured him much favor, while his mind was sustained by the promises of the Savior, for whose sake he had endured the loss of all things. He took his first degree in 1567, and was then chosen one of the fellows of his college. He became Master of Arts in 1561 and Bachelor of Divinity in 1584. He did not receive the degree of Doctor in Divinity till 1613, when it was presented upon him at the time when Frederick, Prince Palestine of the Rhine, who married King James' daughter Elizabeth, visited Cambridge in state. Fuller, remarking on this matter, writes, "What is said of Mount Caucasus, that it was never seen without snow on the top, was true of this reverend father, whom none of our fathers' generation knew in the university before he was gray-headed. He made himself familiar with the Latin, Greek, and Hebrew tongues, and was thoroughly skilled in them. Moreover, he had diligently investigated the numerous writings of the rabbis, so far as they seemed to promise any aid to the understanding of the Scriptures. This is evident from the annotations in his handwriting appended to the Biblia Bombergi, which are still preserved in the library of Emmanuel College. His studies were such as eminently to qualify him to bear an important part in the translating of the Bible. In 1576, he held a public dispute with Dr. Baron, Margaret, Professor of Divinity, upon the Arminian sentiments of the latter. In this debate, Dr. Chatterton appeared to the highest advantage as to his learning, ability, and temper. For 16 years he was lecturer at St. Clement's Church in Cambridge, where his preaching was greatly blessed. In 1578 he delivered a sermon at Paul's Cross, London, which appears to have been his only printed production. About that time, by order of Parliament, he was appointed preacher of the Middle Temple with a liberal salary. It was thought best, perhaps, that a flock of lawyers should have the gospel preached to them by one who had been bred to know the sins of their calling. In the year 1584, Sir Walter Mildmay, one of Queen Elizabeth's noted statesmen, founded Emmanuel College at Cambridge. Sir Walter was not supposed to be a very high churchman, and the Queen charged him with having erected a Puritan foundation. In reply, he told her that he had set an acorn, which, when it became an oak, God only knows what will become of it. And truly it pleased God that it should yield plenteous crops of Puritan hearts of oak, and afford an abundant supply of that sound, substantial, and yet spiritual piety, which stands in strong contrast with all superstition and formality. Emmanuel College Chapel, by order of the founder, was built in the uncanonical direction of north and south. Nearly 100 years after, this non-conforming building was punished by the crabbed prelates who had it pulled down and rebuilt in the holy position of east and west, agreeably to the solemn doctrine of the orientation of churches. Perhaps there was no better way to convert it from the Puritanism wherewith it was infected than thus to give it first an overturn and then a half-turn toward popery. It is likely, however, that the religious peculiarities which long marked this college are to be ascribed less to the position in which the chapel was placed than to the influence of its first master. For this important office, Sir Walter Mildmay made choice of Dr. Chatterton. The modesty of the latter made him quite resolute to refuse the station, till Sir Walter plainly told him, "If you will not be the master, I will not be the founder." Upon this, Dr. Chatterton accepted the office and filled it with zeal and industry and high repute for 38 years. Through his exertions, the endowments of the institution were greatly increased, and it became a nursing mother to many eminent and useful men. At the Hampton Court Conference in 1603, Dr. Chatterton was one of the 4 divines appointed by the king as being the most grave, learned, and modest of the aggrieved sort to present the Puritan interest. Dr. Chatterton, however, took no part in the debates, perceiving that the conference was merely a royal farce, got up to give the tyrant an opportunity to avow his bitter hostility to Puritanism because of its incompatibility with abject submission to arbitrary power. Coleridge, who was a staunch adherent to the Church of England, but by no means blinded on that account to the truth of history, thus expresses his opinion as to the Hampton Court affair. If any man who, like myself, hath attentively read the church history of the reign of Elizabeth and the conference before, and with her pedant successor, can show me any essential difference between Whitgift and Bancroft during their rule, and Bonner and Gardiner in the reign of Mary, I will be thankful to him in my heart and for him in my prayers. One difference I see, namely, that the former, professing the New Testament to be their rule and guide, and making the fallibility of all churches and individuals an article of faith, were more inconsistent and therefore less excusable than the popish persecutors. It was during his mastership of Emmanuel College that Dr. Chatterton was engaged in the Bible translation, in which good work he was well fitted and disposed to take his part. He was a scholar and a ripe and good one, having reached his 80 his knowledge was fully digested and his experience matured, while his natural force was not abated and his faculties burned with unabated fire. Even taught he close of his long life, his eye was not dim and his sight required no artificial aid. Many years after, in 1622, having reached the great age of 85, this Nestor among the divines resigned the office he had so long sustained. Not that he was even then disqualified for its duties by infirmity, but because of the rapid spread of Arminianism and the fear that, if the business were left till after his death, a divine of lax sentiments, who was then waiting his chance, would be thrust into the place by the interference of the court. The business was so managed that Dr. Preston, the very champion of the Puritans, was inducted as Dr. Chatterton's successor. The vivacious patriarch, however, lived to survive Dr. Preston and to see Dr. Sancroft and after him, Dr. Holdsworth, in the same station. This latter incumbent preached Dr. Chatterton's funeral sermon. Dr. Holdsworth used to tell him that as long as he lived he should be master in the house, though he himself was forced to be master of the house. The patriarch was always consulted as to the affairs of the college. The most protracted and useful life must come to its end. There have been various accounts of the time of Dr. Chatterton's death and of the place of his interment, but all mistakes are corrected by his Latin epitaph, if I'm pronouncing that right, which has been found on a monumental stone at the entrance of Emmanuel College Chapel and has been translated as follows. Here lies the body of Lawrence Chatterton, D.D., who was the first master of this college. He died in the year 1640 in the 103rd year of his age. Perhaps such longevity was more common then than now. It is on record that 10 men of Herefordshire, a nest of nesters, once danced the Moorish before King James, their united ages exceeding 8,000 years. Their contemporary, Dr. Chatterton, was more honored by the gravity of his gray hairs than they by the levity of their giddy heels. He was greatly venerated. All his habits were such as inspired confidence in his piety. During the 53 years of his married life, he never suffered any of his servants to be detained from public worship by the preparation of food or other household cares. He used to say, I desire as much to have my servants to know the Lord as myself. These things are greatly to his honor, though his regard to the Lord's day may excite the scorn of some in these degenerate times. Dr. Chatterton is described by Archdeacon Eckhard as a grave, pious, and excellent preacher. As an instance of his power in the pulpit, we will close this sketch with an incident which could hardly have taken place anywhere on earth for the last 100 years. It is stated on high authority that while our aged saint was visiting some friends in his native country of Lancashire, he was invited to preach. Having addressed his audience for 2 full hours by the glass, he paused and said, I will no longer trespass on your patience. And now comes the marvel, for the whole congregation cried out with one consent, For God's sake, go on, go on. He accordingly proceeded much longer, to their great satisfaction and delight, when, says Coleridge, after reading the biographies of Isaac Walton and his contemporaries, I reflect on the crowded congregations, who with intense interest came to their hour and 2 hour long sermons. I cannot but doubt the fact of any true progression, moral or intellectual, in the mind of the many. The tone, the matter, the anticipated sympathies in the sermons of an age form the best moral criterion of the character of that age. Let us not be so unwise as to inquire concerning this. What is the cause that the former days were better than these? For even now people like to hear such preaching as is preaching. But where shall we find men for the work like those who gave us our version of the Bible? Okay, and then, you know, where you saw any of these asterisks, here's the reference, an edition of the Hebrew Bible. Okay. Next person, Francis Dillingham. He was a fellow of Christ College, Cambridge. After the translation was finished, he became parson of Dean, his native place in Bedfordshire. He also obtained the rich benefice of Wilden in the same country, where he died a single and wealthy man. My father, says worthy old Thomas Fuller, was present in the bachelor's school when a Greek act was kept between Francis Dillingham and William Alabaster to their mutual commendation, a disputation so famous that it served for an error or epoch for the scholars in that age, thence to date their seniority. From this it would seem that he was not without reason styled the great Grecian. He was noted as an excellent linguist and a subtle disputant, and was author of various theological treatises. His brother in error, Thomas Dillingham, also minister of Dean, was chosen one of the famous Assembly of Divines at Westminster, but on account of age, illness, and for other reasons did not take his seat. Francis Dillingham was a diligent writer, both of practical and polemic divinity. He collected out of Cardinal Bellarmine's writings all the concessions made by that acute author in favor of Protestantism. He published a manual of the Christian faith, taken from the Fathers, and a variety of treatises on different points belonging to the Romish controversy. Okay, so this Greek act was basically a debate carried on in the Greek tongue. Next person, Dr. Andrews, who had been fellow in Pembroke Hall, was master of Jesus College, Cambridge. He also, became prebendary of, how would you pronounce that? Chichester and Southwell. He too was a famous linguist in his time, like his brother Lancelot, the Bishop of Winchester, whose life had been already sketched as president of the first company of Translators. Okay, Thomas Harrison. He had been student and fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and was now vice master of that important seminary. Thomas Fuller records the following instance of his meekness and charity. I remember when the Reverend Vice Master of Trinity College in Cambridge was told that one of the scholars had abused him in an oration. Did he? Said he, name me? Did he name Thomas Harrison? And when it was returned that he had named him not, then he said, I do not believe that he meant me. We have a strong evidence of his reputation in the university and another duty which was assigned him. On account of his exquisite skill in the Hebrew and Greek idioms, one, he was of the chief examiners in the university of those who sought to be public professors of these languages. Spalding. Dr. Spalding was fellow of St. John's College, Cambridge. He succeeded Edward Lively, of whom we have briefly spoken, as Regius Professor of Hebrew. And then the last one in this, second group that took, the next several books of the Bible up through the Song of Solomon is Andrew Bing. Dr. Bing was fellow of Peterhouse, Cambridge. In course of time, he succeeded Geoffrey King, who was Dr. Spalding's successor in the Regius Professorship of Hebrew. Dr. Bing was Sub-Dean of York in 1606 and was installed Archdeacon of Norwich in 1618. He died during the times of the Commonwealth. Okay, so this will be the last page that we read for this video, okay? These brief notices suffice to show that the members of this company deserve their places among the translators. The quiet and uneventful lives of these secluded students and deep divines have left no strongly marked incidents on the historic page, but their learning still lives and instructs on the pages of their immortal work. The third company of the translators, composed of Oxford divines, met at that famous seat of learning and was fully equal to any other of these companies in qualifications for their important undertaking. The part assigned to this division was from the beginning of Isaiah to the end of the Old Testament. Okay, so that's what we will be going over, these translators that would then finish out the Old Testament from Isaiah to Malachi. Okay, so we'll do that in the next video. So, all right, guys, with that, I will go ahead and close out and bid you all shalom until I get time to do the next video. Shalom.